Got some breaking news in the NFL. The Arizona Cardinals are closing in on making Eagles defensive coordinator Jonathan Gannon their next head coach. That's the latest from our lead NFL insider, Jonathan Jones. Philadelphia, which came up short in the Super Bowl on Sunday, on track to lose both coordinators. OC Shane Steichen hired as the Colts head coach officially today. Gannon replaces Cliff Kingsbury, who was fired after the regular season. Arizona, the final NFL team without an official head coach, but that is set to end. Again, we woke up Sunday morning with 2 head coaching vacancies. The Colts then making the headlines hour before the Super Bowl, and then less than 2 days later, the city with the host title of Super Bowl now zeroing in on its next head coach. And to break it all down, we got Brady Quinn here on set and our lead NFL insider, Jonathan Jones. JJ, naturally, I'm going to turn to you first. What more can you tell us about Jonathan Gannon going to the Cardinals?
Yeah, it started to seem like this was what was going to happen for the Arizona Cardinals so long as all went well post-Super Bowl. So here's what happened with the Cardinals. It's been a bit of a process. So first of all, they offered the general manager job to someone else, Ian Cunningham of the Bears. And then they offered it, and Monty Ossenfort accepted the job. But he accepted the job at a time in the NFL calendar, the playoff schedule, where it was already too late for them to interview Jonathan Gannon or anyone with the Eagles, for that matter, until after the Super Bowl, until the Eagles lost, essentially. And so the Cardinals, while interested in Jonathan Gannon, now that Monty Ossenfort was installed as a general manager, couldn't talk to him for the first time until the Eagles lost. And of course, we know that didn't take place until the Super Bowl. And so because of that, the process dragged on and dragged on. So last week we thought, okay, they're going to narrow it down to Mike Kafka and to Lou Anarumo, the Giants offensive coordinator, the Bengals defensive coordinator, respectively. And then we learned that they wanted to interview Gannon. And of course, they got to know Gannon a little bit through background. His resume speaks for itself the last couple years as Eagles defensive coordinator. I know that Philly fans have been upset with him over time. I thought that he actually coached a pretty decent game, minus some pivotal plays that Andy Reid and Eric Bieniemy and folks were able to exploit his defensive scheme this past weekend. But the Arizona Cardinals wanted leadership. They wanted accountability out of their new head coach. It was something that they were lacking with the previous regime. It's something that they really focused on during this search. They believe they have that in Eagles defensive coordinator Jonathan Gannon.
I think it's an interesting hire for a number of reasons. And when you look at the hiring cycle or the coaching cycle, you usually have teams going the opposite direction. Obviously, a young head coach in Cliff Kingsbury. Now they go young, defensive-minded head coach in Jonathan Gannon. You look throughout the rest of them. Sometimes it's offense to defense or defense to offense. Sometimes it's young to old or old to young, depending on how you're hiring them. This is a hire where, again, I think Jonathan Gannon, for anyone who spent time with him in a production meeting on our side of the business as an analyst, you become incredibly impressed and you say, this guy's on the fast track to becoming a head coach. Well, he now has his opportunity, but that doesn't mean there aren't challenges that come along with it. The Eagles had one of the most talented rosters you will ever find in the NFL. He now takes on one with the Arizona Cardinals that is a very different constructed roster based on their personnel. In Philly, he runs a 4-3 scheme. In Arizona, they've run a 3-4 scheme. You're going to have a decent amount of roster turnover, and it's kind of good time for that only because they do have a bunch of unrestricted free agents and that they'll have to turn over and they'll have to figure out either through the draft or through free agency how to build back up that defense. But the bottom line is he did a tremendous job during his time in Philly. He is one of those bright, young-minded head coaches just on the defensive side of the ball, which still begs the question, how does he handle Kyler Murray? And so who's his offensive coordinator, and how does he go about managing that situation with Kyler Murray, given what we saw, what became public between his relationship with Cliff Kingsbury and some of the issues they had on the field?
And it just comes off the heels of him getting that massive deal before the season, JJ. What did that do to maybe complicate bringing in a guy, and perhaps what did it do to having them make their decision so late in the game here?
Listen, I'm going to tell you because I've heard directly from candidates that that Kyler Murray did complicate things a bit, and his reputation had sort of preceded him as maybe not being the best teammate, as being difficult to work with. I think we've all seen the sort of sideline behaviors. We've seen all of the reports that have come out about him not being a great teammate. I think we also have seen, or at least we have not seen, a lot of teammates coming to his defense, a lot of folks saying, hey, that stuff is patently false. We heard from Patrick Peterson, of course, on the All Things Covered podcast about his opinion of Kyler Murray. I think the quote almost verbatim was, Kyler Murray only cares about Kyler Murray. And of course, Kyler refuted that. All that said, because of that contract, the massive deal, Kyler Murray's not going anywhere. He's not going anywhere anytime soon. And so he was going to have to be a player that folks had to work with. And in this interview process, if you're talking with Kyler or if you're not, you're trying to figure out, hey, is his reputation really who he is? Or is he someone different? And I just need to get in the building and find out. So that's a difficult part. Another difficult part, DeAndre Hopkins is probably not going to be with the Arizona Cardinals next year. You're not going to have your Pro Bowl quarterback for half the season, maybe more than that. You're probably not going to have your #1 overall target in DeAndre Hopkins because he is possibly going to be traded. You're in a difficult division. You're on a team that there's not a ton of resources that are coming from the ownership level. And so it was not deemed to be an incredibly desirable job. I'm not entirely sure that anyone should be surprised if the Cardinals struggle in 2023 as a way to sort of build back up for 24 and beyond, considering where they're going to be on the offensive side of the ball. And one quick thing, Cleveland Plain Dealer is reporting that Drew Petzing is the leading candidate. He's the Browns quarterbacks coach. He's the leading candidate to be the offensive coordinator for Jonathan Gannon out there in the desert. But of course, a full search and interview process will have to take place for that to ultimately become official.
All right, and of course, they'll have a top 5 pick. J.J. Watt also calling it a career in terms of roster changes and management moving forward. J.J., before I let you go, getting back to the team that played at State Farm Stadium and lost the Super Bowl. Now you have Nick Sirianni coming off that loss. He's already loses offensive coordinator and Shane Steichen, zeroing in on a second coordinator. What is the latest in terms of the backfill situation for the Eagles?
So on the offensive coordinator side of the ball, Brian Johnson, who is the quarterback's coach, long time in college. He comes up from Florida and becomes the quarterback's coach for Jalen Hurts. Really influential in terms of the RPO game that the Eagles have been running there. He had a lot of interest around the league as a potential offensive coordinator candidate, but he wanted to see what Shane Steichen was going to do because he was naturally going to be elevated to that offensive coordinator position in Philly if Steichen left. We know that he has now, of course, and so the heavy expectation is Brian Johnson will be the next offensive coordinator there. There will be continuity for the offensive battery, if you will, with the Philadelphia Eagles, Sirianni, Hurts, and Brian Johnson. Meanwhile, with Jonathan Gannon leaving at the defensive coordinator position, one internal name to look for a strong candidate, Denard Wilson. He's the defensive pass game coordinator, DB's coach. He interviewed for the Browns defensive coordinator position that ultimately went to Jim Schwartz. I would imagine the Eagles will run a more robust search for a defensive coordinator. But if you're looking for somebody on the inside, look for Denard Wilson there at defensive coordinator.
All right, Brady, what do you think about Tyree Wilson there, and anything you want to add?
Well, yeah, I think if you're looking at the mock draft and really like what they're looking at potentially doing in the draft this year, I believe Ryan Wilson has them with Tyree Wilson, which would make a lot of sense. Look, they need help off of the edge. The bottom line is J.J. Watt's no longer there. They let go of Chandler Jones a year ago. Marcus Gould, who had a great season a couple years ago, didn't follow up this past season. Majai Sanders is there. He's a third-round pick, still needs some time to develop and maybe even a better fit in a 3-4 outside linebacker scheme as compared to what Jonathan Gannon's going to use with a more traditional 4-3 scheme. Tyree Wilson would still make some sense in this spot given his size, frame. But again, a lot's to be up in the air as far as how they see it. But you got to have pass rushers, you got to have edge rushers. Tyree Wilson could be a guy they'd look at. All
right, check out that mock there on CBSSports.com for more Ryan Wilson. Our thanks to Brady Quinn and Jonathan Jones. JJ, certainly appreciated hopping on with us. Want to let everybody know about all things covered. Patrick Peterson and Brian McFadden, they were at the Super Bowl doing their podcast, getting some great interviews. If you missed any of them, scan that QR code, check them out today.
Do you want a sports network that delivers everything that matters about the game? The highlights, the picks, the instant analysis, no yelling, no fake debates, no politics. Hit the subscribe button and never miss a moment.